everything that's different between the big killer whales and the southern residents comes down to their diet and what they're feeding on. Southern residents are exclusively fish eaters, and they predominantly feed on salmon. That makes up more than 95% of their diet, but in particular, it's Chinook salmon that they're after. It's really interesting that they target Chinook and chum as the largest fish, and I'm assuming that historically, going back thousands of years, there was such an abundance of those fish that it made most sense to target those the most, because they're, you get the most nutritional impact out of a single fish. But as both the numbers of fish are declining and the size of the fish is shrinking, it means it takes more fish that are harder to find to sustain the whales. A lot of people ask, there's so many pink salmon, why don't they eat pink salmon, or why don't they eat something else? But kind of their whole heritage is based around what they eat, and the whole way that they behave and the way their families are structured and how they travel through their habitat is all based on what their prey is. And for such a long time, that has been salmon and Chinook salmon, that really asking them to change what they eat and shift away from that is almost like asking them to give up who they are and what their whole history is. Killer whale, the story goes that name comes from the whalers who used to see killer whales killing other species of whale, so they called them whale killers, and eventually that became killer whale. Some people feel the name makes them seem like vicious predators when really, there's so much more to them than that. So some people prefer calling them orcas. That comes from their scientific name, Orcinus orca, which really in the Latin has some kind of definition like devilfish of the underworld or something like that. So in fact, it's really not that much friendlier of a name, even though we think it sounds better. Killer whales are the largest member of the dolphin family, and they're very widespread. They're found in every ocean of the world. But everywhere you find them, they're in these distinct populations that are specialized to feed on whatever's available in that particular area. So across the world, killer whales will feed on everything from large whales to fish to smaller marine mammals like seals and porpoises, even rays and sharks. But each particular population of killer whales tends to specialize on a small subset of those things. The great thing is that killer whales are such a keystone species for the environment, so they're really indicators of the health of the marine ecosystem. And with the southern residents, of course, they're indicators of the health of the salmon and the entire salmon life history and all the many dozens of species that rely on salmon. And then similarly, the mammal-eating killer whales are an indicator of the health of the other marine mammal populations and all the trophic levels below that, the forage fish and everything that those species rely on. If we lose the southern residents, that's an indicator of everything beneath them in the food web and the health of everything. So are we really willing to lose salmon from the West Coast? Are we willing to lose bait fish and marine birds and seals and sea lions and everything else that kind of relies on some of the same things that the southern residents do? So they're an indicator of the health of the whole marine ecosystem, and how they fare, I think they might sort of be an indicator of where we're heading, and the health of our own environment as well.
Salmon are critical to every aspect of the ecosystem here in the Pacific Northwest. From the small, minute little bugs that would feed upon carcasses, to the birds and scavengers that take advantage of that rich source of protein, to the very trees that make up our forests and greenery of the evergreen state of Washington, they all rely on salmon to bring those nutrients from the ocean back to the stream environment. Salmon life cycle begins in the creek. Tiny eggs the size of a pea, about 3,000 of them, are laid in shallow depressions in the gravel called redds. Once they hatch, the baby salmon bury their heads down into the gravel to try not to get washed downstream. From there, they'll absorb their yolk sac, the nutritious first fuel for them. Once that's absorbed, they begin their life cycle out in the open as a swimming fish. As they mature, they'll begin eating bugs. They'll start traveling down, getting acclimated to the salt water in the estuary where the fresh water and salt water mixes together. And then they'll begin their journey all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, navigating thousands of miles from their home stream to find food and accumulate as much biomass as possible. The species that most people are familiar with when it comes to salmon would be king salmon and sockeye salmon, the most heavily consumed species in our area. And those are the two salmon that travel the farthest upstream. Chum are very short spawning salmon. They only travel 3 to 5 miles upstream to spawn, so they don't accumulate all the fats to be able to accomplish such a long journey. Fats are what orcas need to survive.
To recover salmon in a particular area, we need to look at what's going on in that particular habitat. It's kind of a river by river issue in a lot of ways. So it's death by 1,000 cuts for salmon, and it's a complicated issue to respond to, but a lot of it seems to come back to the more terrestrial part of their habitat with the rivers and the streams and the spawning habitat, which is of course, easier for us to do something about if we choose, rather than the open ocean environment where we still surprisingly don't really know a lot about where salmon go and how they're using that habitat. People ask a lot, what can they do to help the endangered southern residents recover and to help wild salmon populations recover? And one of the easiest things to do is to just spread the story of these whales and these fish that they rely on. And we're lucky to have them as our neighbors. And it's amazing how many people that live in the region, and then definitely visitors to the region, that aren't aware of these incredible animals that live right here. So just spreading the love for them is a very easy thing to do that gets more people kind of engaged in these populations here.
I can remember being a little girl and my dad bringing my sisters and I down to the side of the creek where we could watch literally thousands of fish just right at our feet migrating past. We could see the eagles coming down to feed on the carcasses right in front of us, and even see bear tracks along the sides of the creek. It's a really great way to engage with nature in a way that you can't with any other species. These salmon, they come out, they rely on the streams, and it's really easy to see them. There are a number of different locations around the Puget Sound area that you can view salmon. I recommend finding a place that has a nice healthy creek that you have safe access to. Minter Creek here on the Key Peninsula is an excellent place to view them, as well as Donkey Creek in the heart of downtown Gig Harbor.